moving on to a recap of what we know about classical. So we started to look at classical music last lesson, and this is just a quick recap of what we've learnt so far. So the classical period came after the Baroque period. So the Baroque period was 1600 to 1750, and the classical period was 1750 to 1825. The piano took over from the harpsichord. So the piano had been invented, and it was a much more interesting instrument because it could change dynamics a lot more than the harpsichord could. So lots of composers moved away from harpsichord and started using piano. Instruments were more sophisticated because they'd been developed and new instruments were being invented, and they could change their dynamics. Remember, dynamics means volume, gradually rather than suddenly. Now, when we move gradually from quiet to loud, we call it a crescendo. And the plural, so if you had lots of crescendos, the plural is crescendi, okay? And diminuendi, that's the opposite. So a diminuendo is when you move from loud to quiet gradually in music. So in Baroque music, we had terrace dynamics. In classical music, we had gradual changes, crescendi and diminuendi. The orchestra grew. So the Baroque orchestra was mainly strings. You would have had the Baroque flute in there, the Baroque bassoon. You may have had a Baroque trumpet as well, but other than that, it was mainly strings. When we get to the classical era, the orchestra got much, much bigger, okay, and it started to include many more instruments because more instruments were being invented. So we had a larger woodwind section. So remember, woodwind is things like flutes, clarinets, oboes, bassoons. We had a larger brass section, so we would have had horns and we would have had trumpets as well. We had a percussion section. Percussion is anything that you hit in order to play, so drums. And we would also have still had our strings section, which is violins, violas, cellos, double basses. The texture changed as well. So in Baroque, there was a lot of polyphonic texture. That was when there was lots of different melodies being played at the same time. In the classical era, it moved more towards melody and accompaniment. Now what that means is there's one main tune and some backing, some accompaniment. Okay, so there's one main melody, a clear melody throughout the piece. And finally, it's worth saying there was still some ornamentation in the classical period. So if you hear an ornament, you shouldn't assume that just because there's an ornament that it's Baroque. Ornamentation continued, so it did still happen in classical music, but it wasn't as much as in Baroque. So in Baroque it was very ornamented, and in classical it was still ornamented but not as much. Okay?